In the last gray weeks after Germany's surrender, a transport ship crept into Boston Harbor, carrying women who had been taught to fear America. They were not famous officers. They were nurses, switchboard girls, clerks, radio helpers, and uniformed volunteers from a defeated army. For 13 days they had crossed the Atlantic in crowded compartments, whispering about what waited on the other side. Male guards, locked cells, public shame. Then the gangway dropped, and the first person giving orders on the American pier was a woman. Not a secretary hiding behind a desk, a woman in work trousers and a naval jacket, holding a clipboard like a weapon, calling names over the wind while two male soldiers moved when she pointed. The prisoners stopped so hard the line bent behind them. One of them, Annalise Bauer, was 26, a former hospital clerk from Bremen. She had spent her whole life hearing that authority had a male voice. In Germany, command came with polished boots, hard mouths, and men who never asked. But here, on a prisoner dock in the country that had defeated them, a woman was deciding who moved, who waited, and which truck left first. A second American woman stood beside the scale, checking tags. Another shouted to a driver. Another laughed loudly as she shoved a crate across the pier with both hands. The German women stared as if the harbor itself had made a mistake. Käthe, a nurse from Hamburg, leaned close and whispered, "Are they allowed to do that?" Annalise did not answer, because the terrible part was not that American women were present. The terrible part was that no one seemed surprised. They had crossed an ocean expecting punishment. Instead, the first wound America gave them was proof. The world was larger than the cage they had been raised inside, and once they saw the door, they could never pretend it was a wall. The prisoners were counted, tagged, and led toward military trucks. The American soldiers were firm, but not cruel. No one spat at them, no one struck them, no one called them animals. That alone unsettled them. But the women on the pier unsettled them more. As the convoy pulled out of the harbor district, Boston rolled past the truck slats in wet flashes of brick, glass, smoke, and movement. Women stepped off streetcars with lunch pails. Women walked beside men, not behind them. Women drove delivery cars through the traffic with one elbow out the window, hair pinned under scarves, faces focused and unafraid. A poster on a warehouse wall showed a factory woman with rolled sleeves and a lifted arm. Under it, the words promised that women could do the work that war demanded. Annalisa pressed her fingers against the truck's cold metal rail. "They let her show strength," she said. Marta, sitting beside her, gave a bitter little laugh. "In our town, they would call that shameless." The truck passed a diner where jazz spilled through an open door. The music did not march. It did not obey. It swung, stumbled, rose again, and seemed almost indecently alive. To women who had grown up under banners, chants, slogans, and orders, the sound felt like laughter getting away with something. That afternoon, they were taken to a processing center outside the city. It was supposed to be the beginning of captivity, but for them, it became the beginning of comparison. At the registration table sat another American woman. She wore a khaki uniform, a narrow cap, and a nameplate that read, "Corporal June Whitcomb." Her voice was calm. "Cards ready. Step forward when called. Medical inspection to the left, barracks assignment to the right." No shouting, no performance of power, just procedure. That calmness disturbed the prisoners more than anger would have. In the system they had known, authority had to announce itself. It barked, threatened, slammed doors, and made people shrink. This woman did none of that. And still, everyone obeyed. Inside the building, typewriters clattered in long rows. American women filled out records, stamped forms, checked lists, and spoke to soldiers as if rank did not erase their own minds. One corporal corrected a male sergeant's number count without lowering her eyes. The sergeant looked at the sheet, nodded, and changed the list. Ketha watched with her mouth slightly open. "He listened," she whispered. "Of course he listened," another prisoner muttered. "She had the paper." But that was not the answer. The answer was more dangerous. He listened because in this place her competence carried weight. By 1945, more than 150,000 American women had served in the Women's Army Corps. Millions more had stepped into war work across factories, farms, offices, hospitals, rail yards, and depots. The prisoners did not know all the numbers yet, but they could feel the numbers in the room. They could feel a country that had needed women's hands so badly that it had been forced to admit what those hands could do. Then came the medical line. An American nurse with silver hair at her temples inspected their wrists, eyes, scalps, and breathing. She spoke briskly but gently. She called each prisoner by name when she could pronounce it, and by Miss when she could not. That single word did something strange to them. Miss. Not number, not enemy woman, not disgrace. Miss. For months they had lived with hunger, bombardment, collapse, and fear. They had expected captivity to finish the work of humiliation. Instead, a woman in a white uniform handed Annalise soap, a towel, and a folded blanket. "You're safe here," the nurse said. Annalise almost hated her for saying it, because safety from an enemy was a kind of contradiction no propaganda had prepared her to understand. That night, in a wooden barracks smelling of pine, soap, and damp wool, the prisoners lay awake on clean mattresses. Outside, a spotlight crossed the yard. Somewhere beyond the fence, an American generator hummed, and from the office building came the late-night tapping of typewriters. Women were still working after dark. Not hiding, not apologizing, working. Marta turned on her side and whispered, "In Germany, strength had a man's face." Annalise stared at the ceiling. "Maybe that is why we lost so much of it." No one answered her. The silence did. Over the next week, the processing center became a kind of mirror. The women hated looking into it, but they could not look away. Every hour produced a new fracture in what they had been taught. A woman drove the supply jeep. A woman signed the meal inventory. A woman translated instructions into German with a Missouri accent and a wedding ring on her hand. A woman officer entered the mess hall, corrected 2 guards, and left without anyone laughing. The German prisoners had been raised in a world that praised women for sacrifice, modesty, and obedience. Girls were told that softness was virtue, silence was discipline. Service to husband, children, and state was destiny. Yet here were women who could be kind without being weak, orderly without being cruel, feminine without being powerless. The contradiction did not announce itself as a speech. It came as ordinary life. A pen in a woman's hand, a military stamp under her control, a jeep responding to her foot on the clutch, a male soldier stepping aside because she knew where the next file belonged. The prisoners began to talk at night, not loudly, not freely yet, but the questions came. If women run their offices, who runs their homes? If they earn money, Do their husbands permit it? If a woman can wear rank, can she refuse a man? The questions frightened them because each one touched a locked door. And once a door has a handle, obedience starts to feel less like virtue and more like a room someone else built. After processing, the women were moved inland by train. The windows were narrow, but America kept appearing through them. Small towns, water towers, schoolyards, church steeples, factory roofs. At every station, women stood in the open. Some waved at the soldiers. Some carried bundles. Some sold coffee and newspapers. Some waited alone, unguarded, without the quick, nervous glance the German women recognized from home. Annalisa noticed that first. "They do not walk like they expect to be corrected," she said. Keitha looked out at a woman in a blue dress crossing the platform with a suitcase in each hand. "They walk as if the ground belongs to them." That line stayed with the compartment long after the station disappeared. In one town, the train paused beside a factory yard. Through tall windows, the prisoners saw women operating drill presses, guiding metal sheets, and leaning into the work with rolled sleeves. The building glowed with hot yellow light. Sparks fell and vanished. A forewoman lifted her glove and signaled for a crane to move. A guard told them that women had kept production lines running while men fought overseas. By war's end, over 18 million American women held paid jobs, nearly 1/3 of the workforce. More than 6 million had entered industrial war work. Those numbers moved through the car like weather. In Germany, they had heard speeches about the sacred mother, the loyal wife, the quiet helper. Here, women had welded aircraft, packed ammunition, managed offices, drove ambulances, repaired radios, and kept rail schedules alive. Marta looked down at her thin hands. "We were told labor made men hard," she said. The guard, who had not meant to join their conversation, answered from the doorway. "Labor makes people tired, that's all." It was such a plain sentence that no one knew what to do with it. The camp that received them sat near farmland in the Midwest, surrounded by wire, guard towers, and long, weathered barracks. From a distance, it looked like punishment. From inside, it felt more complicated. They were prisoners. The gates were locked. The roll calls were real. The rules were not suggestions. But the bunks were clean. The food was plain, but enough. The infirmary had medicine. The canteen sold stamps, paper, toothpaste, chocolate, and cheap combs. Their letters home were censored, but they were allowed to write. This confused them more deeply than cruelty would have. Cruelty would have confirmed everything. Fairness had to be explained. Every week, Red Cross inspectors walked through the camp with notebooks. They checked rations, blankets, latrines, and medical supplies. They asked questions. They wrote things down. The prisoners could not understand why an enemy nation would bind itself to rules when no one forced it to be gentle. One afternoon, Annalise asked the camp nurse why she bothered treating them carefully. The nurse, a compact woman named Ruth Caldwell, was wrapping Marta's blistered hand after field duty. "Because you're in our custody," she said. Marta frowned. "That is why you could be cruel." The nurse tied the bandage and looked up. "No, that is why we cannot be." For Annalise, that sentence struck harder than any insult. It suggested that power was not proven by what it could get away with. Power, in this place, was measured by what it refused to do. That idea was almost unbearable. Because if it was true, then much of what she had called strength back home had only been fear wearing a uniform. The prisoners were soon assigned to supervised work outside the wire. Some helped in camp kitchens. Some repaired clothing. Some worked in fields where local farms were short of labor. On their first morning in the fields, the German women stood beside rows of beans, while an American farmer climbed down from a tractor. She was tall, sunburned, and broad through the shoulders. Her name was Mrs. Hazel Mercer. Her husband was overseas, her oldest son was in the Navy, and the farm had not waited for either of them to return. She wiped grease from her hands with a rag and spoke to the guard. "They can start by sorting crates. I'll show 'em the rows after breakfast." The guard nodded. Annalise stared. The woman owned the instructions. The men followed them. Hazel Mercer noticed the prisoners looking at the tractor. "Machine doesn't care who drives it," she said. "Only whether you know the field." It was not a slogan. It was better than a slogan. It was a fact. And facts were harder to dismiss. Across America, women had entered farm work in numbers the prisoners could barely imagine. Some worked through organized agricultural programs. Some kept family farms alive because husbands, sons, and brothers were gone. Some had always worked the land and were only now being seen. By noon, the prisoners' backs ached, their palms burned, dirt lined their nails. Hazel drove the tractor down the row with a confidence that made the machine seem less like iron and more like an extension of her judgment. Ketha watched the tires cut through soft ground. "In our village," she said, "men would laugh at the woman who tried that." Hazel heard the translation and looked over her shoulder. "Then your village wastes women." No one spoke for a long time after that. The workdays changed the prisoners slowly. Not because the Americans preached to them. They rarely did. The lesson came through repetition. A woman running a tractor, a woman paying wages, a woman checking seed sacks, a woman telling a man to load the eastern truck first because rain was coming from the west. Competence appeared again and again until it stopped feeling like an exception. That was the dangerous part. A single bold woman could be dismissed as strange. 1,000 ordinary women could not. At night, inside the barracks, the prisoners rubbed liniment into their wrists and compared what they had seen. Frida, who had been a telephone operator, said she wanted to learn typing properly. Marta said she wanted to drive. Ketha said nothing, but she had begun copying English words into a notebook. Office, wages, permit, college, choice. Choice was the word that troubled her most. It was small, it was quiet, it was everywhere. The strongest lesson came not from factories or farms, but from the homes. By autumn, trusted prisoners were allowed under guard to help local families with laundry, hospital kitchens, harvest meals, and domestic work. The first American house Annalise entered belonged to a school teacher named Mrs. Elaine Porter. Annalise expected commands. Instead, Mrs. Porter handed her an apron and said, "We'll do the dishes together." Together. The word embarrassed her. The kitchen was bright, with lace curtains, stacked plates, a radio on the shelf, and coffee warming on the stove. Nothing in the room looked rich, but everything looked chosen. Photographs on the wall, books beside a rocking chair, children's drawings pinned near the icebox, a calendar marked with school meetings, church suppers, library hours, and dentist appointments. It was ordinary. That was what made it devastating. Mrs. Porter taught full-time. Her husband was away in medical training, funded partly by her wages. At supper, she spoke about household money without lowering her voice. She disagreed with her father-in-law about Europe. She laughed when her son spilled milk. She asked Annalise whether German girls were allowed to study after marriage. Annalise answered carefully, "Some, if it suits the family." Mrs. Porter tilted her head. "And if it suits the girl?" Annalise looked at the plate in her hands and could not answer, because in the world she came from, the girl's desire had never been the starting point of anything. In another home, Marta worked for a bakery owner named Mrs. Rosen. The bakery smelled of flour, yeast, coffee, and sugar. Mrs. Rosen's husband carried trays in the back room. Her nephew kept the accounts. But when a salesman arrived with the wrong invoice, everyone waited for Mrs. Rosen. She read the paper, crossed out a line, and said, "No, I ordered 50 pounds, not 80. Bring the correct bill or take the flour back." The salesman apologized. Marta stared at her. Later, when the shop emptied, Marta asked, "Who owns this place?" Mrs. Rosen dusted flour from her sleeve. "I do." Just 2 words, but they landed like a hammer on a locked chest. I do. Not my husband, not my father, not the state, not the party. I do. The prisoners began to recognize that American freedom was not only written into flags or speeches. It lived in gestures too small for propaganda to notice. A woman taking the car keys, a girl checking books out of a library, a nurse correcting a doctor, a mother saying no at the dinner table and being answered, not punished. A wife opening mail addressed to her own name. A shopkeeper paying a man from her own cash drawer. These were not grand events, they were daily proofs, and daily proofs are the ones that survive. On Sundays, some prisoners were taken to church services under supervision. They saw women sing in choirs, organize refugee drives, teach classes, and stand before the congregation to speak about Europe. Not every American believed in equality the same way. Not every home was kind. Not every man welcomed women taking space. The prisoners saw that, too. Some factory women would lose jobs when soldiers came home. Some husbands wanted the old order restored. Some women were praised during war and dismissed in peace. But even that contradiction taught them something. In America, the door was not always open, but people were arguing about the door. In Germany, many had been taught not to admit there was a door at all. By early 1946, news from Europe reached the camp in heavy pieces. Cities broken, families missing, the Reich gone, hunger everywhere. Men returning with empty sleeves, hollow faces, or not returning at all. Some prisoners wept. Some defended nothing anymore. Some sat on their bunks and stared at the floor as if the boards might explain how an entire life could collapse beneath them. Annalise received a letter from her younger sister in Bremen. The house was damaged. Their mother was alive. Food was scarce. Their old street smelled of wet brick and smoke. No one knew which rules mattered now. At the bottom, her sister had written, "What are we supposed to become?" Annalise folded the letter and kept it under her mattress for 3 days. She did not know the answer, but she knew America had changed the question. Before, she would have asked, "What are we permitted to become?" Now, that felt too small. The camp itself changed with spring. Women planted flowers in coffee tins near the barracks. They stitched curtains out of scrap cloth. They organized language lessons. They traded recipes. They made lists of things they wanted to learn before going home. Typing, bookkeeping, nursing credentials, English, driving. How to ask for wages, how to speak without apologizing first. The guards noticed the change. The prisoners stood differently. Not proudly exactly, not yet, but less folded. One evening, after work, Annalisa stood near the fence and watched Hazel Mercer drive a tractor across the far field as the sun went down. The machine moved through orange dust. Birds lifted out of the grass. The wire between them shone like black thread. Ketha came to stand beside her. "Do you think our country will allow women like that?" Annalisa watched the tractor turn. "No." Then she said, "Not at first." That difference mattered. When repatriation lists finally came, the women packed what little they owned. A comb, a scarf, a notebook, letters, a few English words written again and again until the pencil grooves cut into the paper. Before they left, several local women arranged a farewell supper in the camp hall. There were sandwiches, coffee, jars of pickles, pies cooling on long tables, and soldiers standing awkwardly along the walls. No one called it forgiveness. That word would have been too clean. But there was something in the room that was not hatred. Mrs. Porter brought Annalise a small, used grammar book. "For your sister," she said. Mrs. Rosen gave Marta a paper bag of rolls and a pencil stub wrapped in wax paper. "Write your own accounts," she said. Hazel Mercer shook Ketha's hand with a grip that made her wince. "Field won't wait for permission," Hazel said. "Remember that." Ketha laughed once, then looked away quickly because her eyes had filled. The next morning, buses carried the prisoners back toward the coast. They passed farms, depots, schools, garages, laundries, bakeries, churches, and factories. Places that had once looked like proof of American strangeness now looked like evidence. At the harbor, relief crates were being loaded for Europe. Food, tools, medicine, cloth, milk powder, soap. An American officer told them some of it would go to former enemies. Marta looked at the stacked crates and whispered, "Even mercy here is organized." No one corrected her. The voyage home was colder than the voyage in. The Atlantic rolled under a dull sky. The women stayed on deck longer than they had before, wrapped in coats, holding the rails with red hands. They spoke about America in fragments. The woman with the clipboard. The nurse who said custody meant restraint. The factory forewoman. The school teacher's question. The bakery owner's 2 words. The tractor crossing the field at sunset. None of these memories erased what had happened. None of them made defeat gentle. None of them made guilt disappear. But they gave the women something else to carry into the ruins. A measure. They had seen a society where women were not always free, but freedom was at least visible, argued over, practiced, expected in small, stubborn ways. And that made the old lies harder to wear. When Annalise finally reached Bremen, the city looked like a mouth with broken teeth. Walls stood open to the rain. Windows had no glass. Women queued for food with buckets and shawls. Men returned from war with silence around them like fog. Her sister met her near a damaged tram stop. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the girl noticed the grammar book under Annalisa's arm. "What is that?" Annalisa looked at the cover. worn soft at the corners. "A door," she said. Her sister frowned. Annalisa smiled for the first time in days. "Lessons," she corrected. "For both of us." In the years that followed, some of those former prisoners became nurses, teachers, shop clerks, translators, office workers, farm managers, and mothers who raised daughters differently from how they had been raised. Not all became rebels. Not all spoke publicly. Not all used the word freedom. But many carried America as a private argument. When a man said women were too weak, they remembered Hazel Mercer with grease on her hands. When an office refused to train a woman, they remembered Corporal Whitcomb's stamp hitting the page. When someone told a girl not to want too much, they remembered Mrs. Porter asking, "And if it suits the girl?" When fear told them silence was safer, they remembered Mrs. Rosen standing behind the bakery counter and saying, "I do." The country that captured them had not saved them. That would be too simple. It had done something more uncomfortable. It had shown them that dignity was not a reward handed down by power. It was a habit people practiced until the world had to make room for it. And once they had seen that habit alive in ordinary women, on docks, in offices, in fields, in kitchens, and behind counters, the old cage could never look natural again. America had not handed them freedom. It had shown them the door. And after that, they could never pretend it was a wall.